No one at Harborview South understood why a classified stealth helicopter would one day land in their parking lot, why armed men would walk past surgeons without acknowledging them, or why they would ask for a nurse everyone had already dismissed. But that moment was being set in motion long before the rotors ever cut the air, back when Mara Cole was just the quiet American night nurse no one bothered to learn, the one doctors ignored until it almost cost a man his life. At 1:48 a.m., Harborview South was deep in its graveyard rhythm, the hour where fluorescent lights buzzed like insects, where coffee turned bitter and patience ran thin, where the ER belonged to whoever shouted the loudest, and Mara Cole did not shout at all. She stood at the nurse's station with her shoulders slightly hunched, pale blue scrubs hanging loose on her slim frame, brown hair pulled into a severe bun that showed premature gray at the temples, her face calm to the point of blankness as she updated charts with neat, precise handwriting. To the other staff, Mara was a liability, a woman in her early 30s who avoided eye contact, spoke in a measured whisper, and flinched when metal trays clattered to the floor. "She's too soft for trauma," one resident muttered, not even trying to lower his voice. "Night shift charity hire," another joked. Mara heard all of it. She always did. Her hearing had been trained in places where the wrong sound meant death, but here she kept her eyes down and her mouth shut, letting the insults slide off her like rain off glass. She took the worst assignments without complaint, cleaned bodily fluids no one else wanted to touch, absorbed verbal abuse from doctors twice her age who mistook silence for incompetence, and never once defended herself. To them, she was just an American nurse from nowhere special. Montana, she'd said once. No prestigious hospital pedigree, no ego, no backbone. What they didn't know was that Mara Cole had learned long ago that drawing attention could get people killed. They didn't know her file had arrived from a VA hospital stamped with black bars and vague references. They didn't know the hospital administrator had skimmed it, shrugged, and hired her because night shift was desperate and she didn't ask for much. They didn't know the slight tremor in her hands wasn't fear, it was restraint. Dr. Evan Klein, a second-year surgical resident with a loud voice and louder confidence, leaned over the desk, snapping his fingers. "Cole, room 417. Trauma admit coming up from imaging. Try to keep up this time." Mara nodded once. "Yes, doctor." Her voice was even, emotionless, the way it always was. Behind her, two nurses exchanged smirks. "She moves like she's underwater," one whispered. "I swear, she's going to freeze when it matters." Mara didn't react. She simply walked down the corridor, footsteps quiet on the polished floor, passing curtain bays filled with groans and beeping monitors. The ER smelled of antiseptic and old blood, a smell that layered memories she worked very hard not to touch. Every so often, her fingers brushed the inside of her scrub pocket where an old habit lived. Nothing visible, nothing anyone would notice, just a grounding reminder that this place, unlike the others, was supposed to be safe. When the trauma patient arrived, a middle-aged man pulled from a late-night freeway collision. Klein barely glanced at Mara as he rattled off orders, already halfway to the next case. She checked vitals, noted subtle inconsistencies, watched the rise and fall of the man's chest with more attention than anyone else in the room. Something was off. The breathing pattern wasn't right. The monitor lagged just enough to make her uneasy. She hesitated, considering whether to speak. She had learned quickly at Harborview that speaking up came with consequences. "Move him to observation," Klein said, dismissive. "Nothing critical." Mara opened her mouth, then closed it. She nodded and followed the order, even as a familiar knot tightened in her stomach, the same one she used to feel when someone in charge made a call that didn't sit right and time was about to prove them wrong. As the gurney rolled away, a metal instrument tray slipped from a counter and crashed to the floor behind her. Several nurses jumped. One cursed loudly. Mara didn't jump, but her body reacted before she could stop it, muscles tightening, weight shifting, eyes snapping to exits, calculating angles, threats, and distances in less than a second. She caught herself, relaxed deliberately, and forced her shoulders back into their habitual slump. No one noticed. Or if they did, they chalked it up to nerves. Back at the station, Klein scoffed. "She looked like she was about to faint," he said to another resident. "How does someone like that survive night shift?" Mara returned to her charts, heart steady, breathing controlled. mind already replaying the patient's vitals like a puzzle that refused to fit. She didn't know yet that the man upstairs was not just a civilian accident victim, that his injuries were only the surface of something far more dangerous, or that the decision to move him instead of opening him up immediately was ticking toward disaster. She didn't know that by sunrise, the parking lot would be cordoned off, the air thick with rotor wash, and her name would be spoken with urgency by men who did not make mistakes. All she knew was that the ER hummed on, indifferent, unaware that it had quietly ignored the only person in the building who understood exactly what kind of night was coming. The first thing that went wrong was the monitor. At 2:11 a.m., the steady rhythm above the patient in room 417 stuttered, just once, barely noticeable, the kind of hiccup busy doctors learn to ignore. The second thing was the sound Mara Cole felt before she heard. A deep vibration rolling through the soles of her shoes. Unfamiliar, mechanical, deliberate. She looked up from the chart instantly, spine straightening before she remembered to soften again. Outside, somewhere beyond concrete and glass, something heavy was moving through the air. Inside the room, the patient's oxygen saturation dipped, then dipped again. "He's desatting," Mara said quietly. Dr. Klein didn't look up from the screen. "He's anxious. Bump the O2 and relax." Mara obeyed, fingers moving quickly, eyes never leaving the patient's chest. The asymmetry was worse now. Subtle, but unmistakable. She swallowed. "Doctor," she said again, a fraction louder. His breath sounds on the left. "I said relax," Klein snapped. "We've got 3 ambulances inbound." Mara stepped back, jaw tightening. Somewhere deep in her mind, old training surfaced uninvited. Patterns. Timelines. The clock was no longer on their side. The monitor screamed. The patient's blood pressure collapsed in seconds, alarms layering over each other in shrill panic. Nurses rushed in. Klein swore. "What happened?" "He's crashing," someone yelled. Mara was already moving, hands steady, eyes sharp, her body forgetting to pretend. "Tension pneumothorax," she said flatly. "We need to decompress now." Klein froze. "You don't diagnose," he shot back, fumbling for the crash cart. "We need imaging. We don't have time," Mara said, her voice cutting through the chaos. No tremor now, no hesitation. The patient gasped, lips turning blue. Without waiting, Mara grabbed a large-bore needle from the cart, tore open the gown, and marked the spot with a certainty that stunned the room. "Step back," she ordered. Someone reached for her arm. She shrugged them off and drove the needle in. Air hissed out like a punctured tire. The patient sucked in a ragged breath. The monitor steadied. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Klein stared at her, face pale. What the hell did you just do?" "Saved his life," Mara said, already securing the line. The spell broke. Voices rose. Someone shouted about protocol, about authority, about calling administration. Klein rounded on her, furious. "You're done," he hissed. "You don't get to freelance in my ER." Mara didn't argue. She stepped back, shoulders lowering again, the ghost returning to her posture as quickly as it had vanished. "Yes, doctor." Minutes later, security escorted her toward the locker room, murmurs trailing behind her like smoke. She assaulted a resident. She got lucky. She's unstable. Mara changed out of her scrub slowly, methodically, hands finally shaking now that the danger had passed. She told herself this was fine. She'd moved before. She could disappear again. Then the building shook. Not violently, precisely. A low, controlled thunder rolled through the walls, rattling lockers and setting off car alarms outside. Mara froze, breath caught halfway in. She knew that sound. Knew it the way a sailor knows the sea. Over the hospital PA, confused voices overlapped. "Is that a helicopter?" "That's not medevac." Outside, the night split open as a matte black aircraft descended into the parking lot. Lights dark, rotors screaming at high idle. Staff flooded to the windows. Armed men poured out, moving fast, scanning, securing. Not police. Not National Guard. One of them walked straight through the ER doors like he owned the place. "We're looking for Mara Cole," he said, voice calm, final. "American. Female. Night nurse." Heads turned. Whispers erupted. Someone laughed nervously. "You mean the one who just got fired?" The man's expression hardened. "Then you'd better hope she hasn't left yet," he said. "Because the operator on that bird doesn't have time for your paperwork, and she's the only reason he's still alive." Down the hall, Mara stood still, eyes closed, as the sound of rotors filled the night. She had tried to be invisible. The night had decided otherwise. Mara Cole didn't run. When the door to the locker room opened and the men in dark gear filled the doorway, she was already calm again, breathing slow, mind clear. The man in front, broad, weathered, American flag stitched backward on his shoulder, looked at her like he was seeing something rare. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice, "we need you. Not Nurse Cole. Not employee. Just you." She nodded once. No questions. No dramatics. The ER watched in stunned silence as she walked back through the same halls where she'd been ignored, this time flanked by men who treated her like command. The SEAL operator was moved into a secured bay, doors locked, armed guards posted. Doctors were told to assist, not lead. When someone objected, the answer was simple: federal authority. Mara scrubbed in, hands perfectly steady, eyes focused in a way that made seasoned surgeons quiet. She gave instructions without raising her voice, and they were followed. She worked with the efficiency of someone who had done this under worse conditions, with fewer tools and no margin for error. When it was over, the operator was alive, stable, breathing on his own. The helicopter lifted off before dawn, taking the team and their wounded with it. There were no press releases, no explanations, just silence, and a hospital full of people trying to reconcile what they had seen. Administration offered apologies. Doctors avoided her eyes. Mara listened politely, then declined every offer to stay. By morning, her locker was empty. Weeks later, a new training program quietly launched at a stateside base. Combat medics learned from a woman who didn't shout, didn't posture, and didn't tolerate ego, only precision. Back at Harborview South, the night shift felt different. Quieter, humbled, because they learned something they wouldn't forget. The most dangerous person in the room isn't always the loudest. Sometimes, she's the nurse no one saw, until it mattered.